The night was cold, and the rain had been pouring for hours. The flashing blue and red lights of the highway patrol car reflected off the wet asphalt, painting the scene with an eerie glow. Officer Dean Carter stood over the lifeless body of his female coworker, Officer Rachel Green. Her body lay in a pool of blood, her face frozen in terror, and her eyes staring up into the darkness, wide open, as though pleading for help. The rain splashed around her, making the situation feel even more surreal. Dean had done it. He had murdered Rachel. The weight of the crime crushed him, but there was no turning back now. He had to make sure the secret never came out. Just moments ago, they had been working together, patrolling the quiet stretch of road. Dean had been hiding his dark secret for years, a secret that could ruin his life. And Rachel, ever the curious one, had started to put the pieces together. She had been asking too many questions. Too many questions that Dean couldn't afford to answer. That's when he knew he had to act. Now, standing over her body, Dean realized just how far he had gone to protect himself. The cold, wet air stung his face, but the numbness inside him was worse. He was shaking, but not from the cold. He could feel the pressure building inside him. He couldn't keep this lie going for much longer. As he glanced around the empty highway, he wondered if anyone had seen them. Was anyone watching? Could they trace it back to him? His heart raced as he heard the distant sound of a car approaching. He quickly crouched down and wiped his hands on his uniform, trying to clear the blood, but it was useless. There was no way to erase what had just happened. The sound of the car grew louder, and Dean knew that someone would soon be here to witness the scene. He had no time to think, no time to plan. He had to act fast. The car pulled up slowly, its headlights casting long shadows on the ground. Dean froze, his eyes darting to the front of the car. It was an unmarked vehicle, typical for highway patrol officers who worked the graveyard shift. The door opened, and a figure stepped out. "Officer Carter?" the voice called, barely audible over the rain. "What's going on here?" Dean's mind raced. He had to think of something, anything. He couldn't let anyone find out what he had done. The figure slowly approached, but Dean knew it was too late. His heart thudded in his chest as he looked down at Rachel's body one last time. The voice came again, louder this time. "Officer Carter? Is everything all right?" Dean turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. The sound of the approaching footsteps made his blood run cold. He was trapped. He had no choice now. Before he could react, the figure reached the body of Rachel. The voice gasped, "Oh my God, what happened?" Dean's heart stopped. The weight of his actions pressed down on him harder than ever. He had killed Rachel to cover up his secret, but now, it seemed like the entire world was closing in on him. He glanced nervously around, unsure of what to do next. Would he be able to cover his tracks? Would the mystery of Rachel's death ever be solved? Or had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? The footsteps drew closer. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we have to go back to a few months earlier, when things were different. Back when Officer Dean Carter still had everything to lose. Back when his dark secret was only known to him. Dean had always been a quiet man, serious and focused on his work as a highway patrol officer. He had a reputation for being dependable, even-tempered, and hardworking. It wasn't until he met Rachel Green that his world began to change. Rachel was everything he wasn't: outgoing, friendly, and a bit of a free spirit. She had joined the force a few years after Dean, and the two had been paired up on several patrols. At first, their interactions were polite, professional, but over time, they became friends. Rachel was bright and ambitious. She often asked Dean about his past, about how he had gotten into law enforcement. He had always been vague about it. There were things in his past that he didn't want to revisit, things that were better left buried. But Rachel was persistent, and she could tell there was something off about him. She started probing deeper, asking questions that made Dean uncomfortable. It was clear that she was digging for something. She wasn't just asking for the sake of conversation. She was looking for answers. Dean couldn't let her get too close to the truth. A few weeks before that fateful night, Rachel had come to him with an idea. She had found some odd reports and anomalies in their department's files. Things that didn't add up. Dean knew what those reports were. He had buried the evidence years ago, hoping no one would notice. But Rachel had. and she was determined to find out more. "Dean, something's not right," Rachel had said one night, her voice low. "I've been looking through the case files from the past few years. There are discrepancies, things that don't make sense. I think someone's covering something up." Dean had tried to brush it off, telling her it was nothing. But Rachel wasn't convinced. She had insisted they look deeper into it. That's when Dean knew he had to make a choice. He couldn't let her get too close. He couldn't let her discover his secret. He had worked too hard to bury it. And now, Rachel's curiosity was threatening everything. That night, Dean had been preparing to confront Rachel. He knew he couldn't let her expose him. She would have to be silenced. But he hadn't expected it to be so difficult. Rachel was like a dog with a bone. She wouldn't stop until she had answers. And Dean knew that if she found out the truth, it would destroy everything he had built. The night had started like any other patrol shift. But by the time it ended, Dean knew his life would never be the same again. The rain continued to fall as Dean turned away from the body of Rachel Green. The footsteps were closer now, and his mind raced with the possibilities of what might happen next. Would he be able to cover up his crime? Would anyone ever know what had really happened on that dark stretch of highway? Or would his dark secret finally be revealed? The sound of footsteps grew louder. Dean's heart hammered in his chest as he stood frozen, staring at the figure in front of him. He had to think fast. His mind scrambled for a plan, but the storm of emotions, guilt, panic, fear, clouded his thoughts. The figure, now only a few feet away, reached the edge of Rachel's body, her lifeless form illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car. "Officer Carter?" The voice called again, this time with more concern. Is she okay?" Dean quickly snapped his head to the side, his eyes wide and panicked. It was Officer Jake Morrison, a fellow highway patrol officer from another district. Jake was a good guy, one of the more dependable officers on the force. Dean had worked alongside him on several occasions. But now, the thought of Jake finding Rachel's body made his blood run cold. Dean's throat went dry. He could feel the weight of the lie he was about to tell. Just one more in a long line of lies he'd been feeding to cover up his dark secret. She's fine," Dean stammered, trying to sound convincing. Just got knocked out. I was about to call for backup." Jake didn't seem entirely convinced. He stared down at Rachel's body, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Knocked out? Are you sure? I don't see any sign of injury." Dean cursed under his breath. Jake was too smart for his own good. He was starting to ask too many questions. And if he kept asking, Dean wouldn't be able to hide the truth. "She was attacked," Dean lied quickly. "I got here just in time to try and help her. I think she's unconscious, but I couldn't get her to wake up." Jake's eyes narrowed, but then he glanced around. "But I don't see any sign of struggle, no marks, no blood. I don't know, man." Dean cut him off, trying to act as frustrated as possible. "I told you, I didn't get here in time to stop whatever happened. We need to focus on getting her help, not figuring out what went wrong." Jake hesitated for a moment, seemingly caught between suspicion and concern. Dean could see the gears turning in his mind. But, just as quickly as the suspicion had risen, it seemed to fade. Jake seemed to accept Dean's story, at least for the moment. "All right," Jake said, taking a step back. "Let's get her to an ambulance." "You're right. We need to focus on helping her." Dean let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He forced himself to stay calm, even though his nerves were raw. His mind raced. He couldn't afford to slip up now, not with Jake standing here. He had to make sure the story stayed straight. He had to get Rachel out of this situation before anyone started asking too many questions. The two of them worked quickly, lifting Rachel's body from the ground and placing her in the back of the patrol car. Dean didn't allow himself to feel the sting of guilt as he gently laid her down. He couldn't afford to feel anything for her, not now. He had to focus on getting her out of sight. The longer Rachel was out of the picture, the safer he would be. As the car began to move, heading toward the nearest hospital, Dean couldn't help but wonder, was this going to be enough? Was Rachel going to stay quiet? Or would she be the one to tear his world apart? The days leading up to the incident had felt like a slow descent into darkness for Dean. It all began months earlier, When Rachel first started questioning him about the strange events surrounding their department, Dean had been careful. He had always made sure his personal life remained a well-guarded secret. But Rachel's growing curiosity threatened to crack open the door he'd worked so hard to keep shut. It had all started innocently enough. She was just doing her job, reviewing reports, looking for patterns in the cases they'd worked over the years. But when Rachel started poking around into some cold cases, Dean began to feel the weight of his own lies. There were certain things buried in those files, things he'd been involved in, that he couldn't allow to come to light. The truth was ugly, and it would ruin everything. But Rachel wasn't like the others. She wasn't just going to let things slide. She was determined to get to the bottom of what was going on in their department. She had been digging for weeks, and the more she uncovered, the closer she came to discovering the truth. One afternoon, she had approached Dean directly in the break room, her face serious, eyes filled with concern. "Dean," she had said, her voice low, "there's something weird going on. I've been looking into some of the older cases from when you first joined the force. Something doesn't add up. There's a gap in the records, and a few names that don't seem to match up." Dean had felt his blood run cold at the mention of those names. He had worked so hard to erase every trace of his past, to make sure no one would ever find out what had happened. But Rachel's curiosity was starting to unravel everything he'd worked so hard to hide. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dean had replied quickly, brushing it off with a forced smile. "Sometimes things get mixed up in the paperwork. It happens." Rachel had shaken her head, unconvinced. "No, Dean, this isn't just a paperwork issue. I think someone's covering something up, and I think it's bigger than we realize." That had been the turning point. Dean knew that Rachel had gotten too close. She was smart, too smart for her own good. And now, it seemed, she was digging deeper than ever before. If she uncovered the truth, his life would be over. His career, his reputation, everything, gone. He knew what he had to do. As the patrol car drove through the darkened streets, heading toward the hospital, Dean's mind raced. The adrenaline from the night's events hadn't worn off, and he could feel the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. He couldn't afford to let anyone suspect him. Not Jake, not anyone. If Rachel made it through, if she woke up and started talking, he was finished. They arrived at the hospital, where an ambulance was waiting. Dean helped load Rachel into the vehicle, trying to look as professional and calm as possible. But inside, his heart was pounding. He was watching his world crumble with every second that passed. As they wheeled Rachel into the emergency room, Dean stepped back, feeling like a ghost in his own body. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The walls were closing in on him. What if someone found out? What if Rachel woke up and remembered everything? "Officer Carter, can I speak with you for a moment?" Dean turned to see Jake standing behind him, his face now full of concern. The air between them felt thick with tension, and for a moment, Dean thought he might pass out. Jake's eyes narrowed. "What's going on, man? You're acting strange." Dean's stomach churned. He couldn't let Jake get suspicious. "Not now. Everything's fine," Dean lied again, forcing a smile. "Rachel's going to be fine. We just need to give her some space." Jake didn't seem entirely convinced, but he nodded. "All right. Just keep me updated." As Dean walked away from the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. What would happen next? Would Rachel wake up? Would she expose everything? Or was he truly safe? One thing was certain. The clock was ticking. Dean couldn't sleep. It had been 3 days since he had sent Rachel to the hospital. 3 long days filled with tension, guilt, and fear. Each hour that passed felt like a countdown, and the constant worry of Rachel waking up and revealing the truth kept him on edge. Every phone call, every knock at the door, sent his heart racing. His nerves were shot. Rachel had been in a coma since the night he left her on that cold stretch of highway. Doctors said it was from the blunt force trauma to the head. But Dean knew the truth. He knew it wasn't an accident. He had been the one to hit her. He had struck her, knocked her unconscious, and left her for dead in the rain. But somehow, she survived. Now, all he could do was wait. He had told himself that if Rachel woke up, he would handle it. He would find a way to silence her. After all, he had done it before. He had covered up his tracks for years, and one more wouldn't make a difference. But as the days dragged on, his confidence was beginning to crack. Dean sat in his small apartment, the blinds drawn tightly as the rain pattered against the windows. The world outside was quiet, but inside, his thoughts were anything but. He had spent the past few days trying to keep a low profile, making sure no one suspected anything. But there was always that lingering feeling, that gnawing fear, that someone was getting closer to the truth. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. The caller ID read, Jake Morrison. Dean's stomach dropped. He didn't want to answer it. He didn't want to have to lie to Jake again. But he had no choice. He couldn't afford to seem like he was avoiding the situation. He grabbed the phone and answered. Hey, Jake, he said, trying to sound casual. Dean, Jake's voice came through the receiver, sharp and serious. I need to talk to you. It's about Rachel. Dean's heart skipped a beat. His mind immediately went into overdrive. What was Jake asking about? Had Rachel woken up? Had she said something? What's going on? Dean tried to sound calm, but he could hear the tremble in his voice. They're moving her to another facility, Jake said. The doctors think she might be able to regain consciousness soon. But, I'm starting to get worried, man. Dean clenched his fists, trying to keep his composure. Worried? What do you mean? Jake sighed, his voice lower now. I don't know. Something's off. She's been in a coma for a few days, and I was looking through her records. I found something strange, something that doesn't match up. I know we were supposed to drop it, but I think we need to look into it again. Dean's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what Jake was talking about. The same thing Rachel had been investigating before the incident. The case files, the missing pieces of evidence, the inconsistencies. He had been so careful to bury the truth. But now, it seemed like it was all starting to unravel. Jake, stop, Dean said quickly, his voice rising. You're overthinking things. It's probably nothing. Just let it go, all right? But Jake didn't seem convinced. I can't just let it go, Dean. Not when it's so weird. I don't know, man. Something doesn't feel right. Dean took a deep breath. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. He had to stop Jake from investigating any further. He had to keep Rachel's secret buried. You're just being paranoid, Dean finally said, his tone more forceful. Rachel's going to be fine. She's in good hands. There's nothing more to it. Jake paused for a moment. Dean could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, Jake spoke again. All right, I guess you're right. I'll drop it for now. But if anything changes, you'll let me know, right? Dean's heart was pounding in his chest. He had dodged the bullet for now. But how long would that last? Of course, Dean said, forcing a smile into his voice. You'll be the first to know. After a few more minutes of small talk, Dean ended the call. He sat back in his chair, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Rachel was still out there, still alive, and Jake was getting suspicious. He couldn't keep up this charade forever. Dean paced back and forth across his apartment, his mind spinning. What if Rachel woke up and remembered everything? What if Jake kept digging into the case? The truth was slipping further out of his grasp with every passing day. There was no more room for mistakes. If Rachel came, she had to stay quiet. If Jake kept pushing, he would have to shut him up, too. Dean knew what he had to do. The next day, Dean drove to the hospital. He told himself it was just a routine checkup, just making sure Rachel was still unconscious and that everything was fine. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. He was going there to finish what he had started. He parked the patrol car in the hospital lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His heart thudded in his chest, louder than the sound of the engine. Every part of him screamed to turn back, to leave Rachel's fate in the hands of the doctors. But his instincts told him something else. He couldn't leave it to chance. He had to make sure Rachel never woke up. Not if she was going to expose him. Not if she was going to ruin everything. Dean stood outside the hospital for a moment, looking up at the building. The lights in the windows flickered as nurses and doctors moved through the halls. The hospital was a busy place, but Dean knew that even in the chaos, there was always an opportunity for someone to slip through the cracks. He stepped inside, walking down the sterile white hallways. His footsteps echoed against the cold tile floor. As he passed by room after room, his heart raced. Rachel's room was at the far end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and Dean could see the faint glow of the lights inside. He swallowed hard and took a deep breath. If he was going to do this, it had to be now. As Dean approached her room, he felt a chill run down his spine. The door creaked open as he pushed it gently. There she was, lying in the bed, still unconscious. Her pale face looked almost peaceful, but Dean knew the truth. She wasn't at peace. She was a threat. He walked closer to her bed, his hand trembling as he reached into his pocket. He had come prepared. He wasn't going to leave anything to chance. But just as he was about to make his move, a voice came from behind him. Dean? Dean froze. His blood ran cold. It was Jake. Dean's heart skipped a beat. He froze in place, his hand still in his pocket, fingers wrapped around the cold metal of the syringe he had brought. His mind raced. He hadn't heard Jake enter the room. How long had he been standing there? What had he seen? He turned slowly, his stomach a tight knot of panic. There stood Jake, his face a mix of confusion and concern. Dean quickly shoved the syringe back into his pocket, his body stiff with tension. Jake, Dean said, his voice coming out in a strained whisper. He forced a smile, but it felt like the worst lie he'd ever told. What are you doing here? Jake didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered between Dean and the unconscious form of Rachel on the hospital bed. He raised an eyebrow, sensing something was off. I could ask you the same thing, Jake replied, his tone cautious. I thought you were just checking on her, not standing over her like that. Dean's breath caught in his throat. He took a slow step toward Jake, trying to act casual, but his nerves were about to betray him. I just came to see if she was doing better, Dean said, his voice faltering. You know, make sure everything's okay. They've been saying she might wake up soon, so I thought I'd check in. But it's probably better if we don't disturb her too much. Jake's gaze didn't leave Dean, and there was something in his eyes, something Dean couldn't quite place, that made his skin crawl. Jake's suspicion was growing, and Dean could feel it. You've been acting strange, Dean, Jake said quietly, his voice lowering. You've been acting really strange ever since Rachel ended up here. I've been trying to ignore it, but it's hard to miss. Why are you so nervous? What's really going on here? Dean forced his shoulders to relax, but his mind was in full panic mode. Jake was smart, too smart. He couldn't let him see through the facade. Not now. Not when everything was about to come crashing down. Jake, you're overthinking this, Dean said quickly. Rachel's fine. She's just unconscious. It's nothing serious. I just want to make sure she's okay. There's nothing else going on. Jake didn't seem convinced. His eyes narrowed, and Dean could feel the pressure building between them. It was like a game of cat and mouse. But Dean was the one trying desperately to hide the truth, and Jake was starting to close in. You're lying, Jake said bluntly, taking a step closer. I don't know what's going on, but I can feel that something isn't right. You've been acting weird ever since the accident, and now you're here, all nervous, looking like you're about to do something you shouldn't. Dean's pulse quickened. This was it. Jake was getting too close. If he didn't do something fast, everything would unravel. Jake, please, Dean said, his voice low but urgent. You've got to trust me. I'm just trying to do the right thing here. Rachel's going to be fine. I promise. Jake's gaze didn't soften. He wasn't buying it. Why did you come here, Dean? Jake asked, his voice almost a whisper. Why are you so focused on Rachel all of a sudden? We're officers. We don't usually act like this unless we're hiding something. Dean swallowed hard. Jake was right. He was hiding something, but he couldn't let it slip now. Not when everything he had worked for, the career, the life, was at stake. He had been so careful for so long. But this was different. Jake wasn't some rookie. He wasn't easily fooled. I came here because I care, okay? Dean said, his voice trembling. I care about Rachel. I don't want her to wake up and have to face whatever happened out there. It was a mistake, Jake. A freak accident. I don't want her to remember it. I don't want anyone to remember it. Jake didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes still locked on Dean, studying him with the intensity of someone trying to break a person's mask. And for the first time since the whole nightmare began, Dean felt like his mask might crack. He could feel the cold sweat gathering on his brow. He couldn't let Jake see his fear. He had to stay calm. But before he could speak again, Jake spoke first. "I'm not stupid, Dean," Jake said, his voice firm. "I've seen this kind of thing before. When people start acting like this, it's usually because they have something to hide. And I think you're hiding something." Dean's mind raced as Jake took another step closer. He had only a split second to make a decision. At that moment, Dean's thoughts were clearer than they had ever been. He knew what he had to do. There was only one way to protect his secret and get out of this situation. The way things were going, there was no turning back. He had to stop Jake from digging any further. Dean's eyes flicked around the room, his thoughts working quickly. The syringe in his pocket. The small, quiet room. It was the perfect opportunity. Jake was too close, too determined, and Dean's heart raced as the final decision clicked into place. Before Jake could say another word, Dean reached into his pocket and pulled out the syringe. In one swift motion, he moved forward, pushing the needle into Jake's neck with the precision of someone who had done this before. Jake's eyes widened in shock, his hand immediately going to his throat. He staggered backward, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the drug in the syringe had already begun to take effect. Dean watched as Jake's legs buckled beneath him, his face turning pale as he crumpled to the floor. The entire process had taken mere seconds, but it felt like an eternity to Dean. His heart raced, his breathing shallow, as he looked down at Jake's unconscious body. Everything had just changed. The door to Rachel's room seemed to grow smaller as Dean stood over Jake, the weight of what he had just done crashing down on him. He had killed before to cover his secret, but this was different. He had taken out someone who could have uncovered everything. Jake had been too close, and now he was nothing more than a threat silenced. Dean glanced over at Rachel, still unconscious in her bed, and felt a surge of fear. He had no idea when she would wake up or what she would remember. But now, he had no choice but to deal with one problem at a time. Jake was out, but Rachel could still ruin him if she remembered. The door clicked open behind him, and for a split second, Dean's entire body tensed. But it wasn't Jake. It was a nurse, stepping into the room to check on Rachel's vitals. She looked at Dean, seemingly unfazed by the presence of the unconscious officer on the floor. "Everything okay, Officer Carter?" she asked, looking between him and Jake's collapsed form. Dean forced a smile, his hands trembling. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said. Just making sure everything's under control." The nurse nodded, unaware of the danger lurking just beneath the surface of Dean's calm demeanor. As she continued with her work, Dean's thoughts drifted back to Rachel. There was still one more thing left to do, and he couldn't afford to wait any longer. Dean stood motionless, his eyes locked on Jake's unconscious body. The nurse moved about the room, oblivious to the unconscious officer sprawled on the floor just a few feet from Rachel's bed. He couldn't afford to let the nurse see anything. Not now. Not when things were already so out of control. With a calm he didn't feel, Dean took a deep breath and turned to the nurse, forcing his face into a mask of professionalism. "Everything's fine," he said again, the words slipping out more easily than he had expected. "I think I might have just startled him a bit. He's had a long shift. Probably just needed a rest." The nurse glanced at Jake, then back to Dean. She hesitated for a moment, her brow furrowing, but seemed to buy the story. "All right, if you're sure. Just let me know if there's anything I can do." "Of course," Dean replied quickly, offering her a reassuring smile. The nurse didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press the issue. She moved over to Rachel's side, checking the monitors, making sure the patient was stable. Dean stood by the door, watching her every move, his mind spinning. His heart was still pounding in his chest. The syringe he'd used on Jake was still in his pocket, and he was now considering what to do with the officer lying unconscious on the floor. Jake had been a problem, but now he was out of the equation, for the moment, anyway. He had to make sure nothing went wrong from here. He couldn't risk another moment of exposure. Not when things were this close to spiraling completely out of control. The nurse finished her work, taking one last look at Rachel before giving Dean a polite nod and exiting the room. As soon as the door clicked shut, Dean exhaled, his breath shaky. He had to act quickly. Time was running out. His first thought was Jake. What should he do with him? It wasn't like he could just leave him here, unconscious and exposed. There was a chance someone would find Jake soon, especially if the nurse returned. He had to get Jake out of the room and out of sight, fast. But then his mind snapped back to Rachel. She was still lying in the bed, vulnerable. If she woke up and saw Jake on the floor, saw him acting strangely, she would start asking questions. Questions that could lead to the one thing Dean feared more than anything: the truth. He glanced over at Jake, still unmoving on the floor, and weighed his options. It would take just a few minutes to drag him into a storage closet or a hallway. No one would find him for hours, maybe even longer. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was Rachel. Dean's hand instinctively went to his pocket again, feeling the sharp edge of the syringe. His mind raced with dark thoughts. Could he use it on Rachel, too? Could he make sure she never woke up, never had the chance to speak, to expose him? He clenched his fist around the syringe. But something stopped him. A flicker of hesitation that felt like guilt, though Dean quickly pushed it aside. He had to finish this. He had to make sure there were no more loose ends. He turned back to Jake's limp form, swallowing hard. He had to make sure Jake didn't wake up and complicate things further. Just as Dean was about to move toward Jake, the door opened again. "Dean!" a voice called from the hallway, making him freeze in place. It was Officer Mia Sullivan, another member of the Highway Patrol. She was someone he'd worked with before, though not as closely as Jake. Mia stepped into the room, her eyes briefly flicking to Jake's body, then back to Dean. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone a mix of confusion and concern. "Why's Jake on the floor?" Dean's blood ran cold. Mia was sharp. She had a knack for noticing things that others missed. He had to think fast. Before he could respond, Mia stepped closer, glancing at Rachel in the bed, her face still pale, her body motionless. "You've been here a while," Mia said, her gaze softening. "How's she doing?" "She's doing better," Dean replied quickly, his voice steady. He took a step toward her, hoping to steer the conversation away from Jake. "She's stable. They just don't know when she'll wake up yet." Mia nodded, but her eyes didn't leave Jake's still body. "Dean, you didn't, did you? Did you do something to him?" Dean froze again. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he thought Mia had somehow figured it out. He quickly forced his thoughts into a tight box, trying to keep his composure. "What do you mean?" Dean asked, his voice tight. Mia raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Jake's been acting weird lately." "You've been acting weird, too. And now he's out cold on the floor. Come on, man. I know you better than that." Dean's pulse quickened, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was about to slip up. His mind was racing, trying to come up with a convincing answer. He needed to talk his way out of this. "He just fainted," Dean said quickly, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Nothing serious. Just a little exhausted, probably from working too much. I tried to get him to sit down, but he collapsed." Mia didn't look convinced. Her brow furrowed in suspicion, and for a moment, Dean felt as if his entire life was hanging on the edge. Mia's eyes flickered from Jake to Rachel, then back to him, like she was trying to piece together something he wasn't saying. "You sure about that, Dean?" Mia pressed, her voice quieter now. "This doesn't seem like just exhaustion. Something's off. I think you're hiding something." Dean felt his stomach twist, but he kept his face neutral. He couldn't afford to have Mia investigating him, too. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. "Trust me, Mia," Dean said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's fine. Just let me handle it. Jake will be okay. He just needs a little rest, that's all." Mia took a long, hard look at him, clearly still skeptical, but she didn't press the issue any further. "All right, Dean," she said slowly. "I'll trust you. But if anything happens to Jake, I'll be the first to know." "Of course," Dean replied, his voice calm. He let out a quiet breath of relief as Mia turned to leave. But as the door clicked shut behind her, Dean's relief was short-lived. He was running out of time, and Mia's suspicion was just another problem he couldn't afford. He turned back to Jake's body. This wasn't over. He had to keep it together. There was only one thing left to do. Make sure Rachel stayed quiet and make sure Jake stayed down. With Mia out of the way, Dean moved quickly. He grabbed Jake's body, dragging him across the floor toward the storage closet. He had to get him out of sight. Once that was done, Dean would focus on the next problem. Rachel? And he couldn't let her wake up. Not yet. Not when there was so much left to lose. Dean paused for a moment, standing over Jake, his breath shallow. His mind was racing. The walls were closing in. "Stay down, Jake," Dean whispered to the unconscious officer. "I'm the only one walking out of here." With that, he stepped out of the room, glancing one last time at Rachel. The silence in the hospital room seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds on his chest. He had to act quickly, before anyone else started asking questions. Time was running out. The air outside the hospital was crisp, and Dean felt a cold shiver run through him as he stepped out of the building. The night sky was overcast, and the streetlights illuminated the parking lot in harsh, yellow halos. He didn't take a deep breath as he usually would. It felt as though the air around him had thickened, smothering him. He was carrying a weight that didn't show on the outside, but pressed heavily on his chest. The more time passed, the more he felt like everything was slipping further and further from his control. It had been hours since he had locked Jake in the storage closet. He'd done it without hesitation, dragging the officer's limp form, making sure no one saw, and leaving him behind. His mind raced, but his body remained eerily calm. He had to be careful. Every step had to be perfect. Dean reached his patrol car, his hand resting on the door for a moment. His eyes darted around the parking lot. No one was around. No one knew what had happened in that room, but he couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. He slid into the driver's seat, gripped the steering wheel, and started the engine. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car as he pulled out of the parking lot. He couldn't go home, not yet. He needed to think, to plan. The hospital had been a near miss, but now, Rachel was still a threat. He had told himself he wouldn't hurt her, not if he could avoid it. He had convinced himself she'd be fine, that her memory would fade with the coma. But now, every passing second felt like an eternity. What if she woke up? What if she remembered him, what he'd done? It was only a matter of time before she could become his undoing. He couldn't allow that. Dean drove through the quiet streets of the city, passing empty stores and dark houses. The clock on his dashboard flicked over to 2:30 a.m. A small corner of his mind began to piece together a new plan, one that could solve everything once and for all. He parked the car in a secluded area by a small diner that closed late at night. There was no one around. The streetlights cast long shadows, and Dean could barely see the outline of the diner's sign. He needed privacy, space to think without interruption. It wasn't just Rachel anymore. It was everyone. Jake, Mia, the entire force. It was all threatening to come apart. They would come looking for Jake. They would notice his absence. And soon enough, someone would start looking into Rachel's case, into the strange circumstances surrounding the accident. The lies, the inconsistencies. It would all come crashing down. Dean wasn't the type to panic, but that didn't mean the fear wasn't creeping up behind him. He had to think quickly. He couldn't afford to wait for someone to catch onto the threads he was carefully unraveling. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his stomach turning as he saw the name on the screen. Mia Sullivan. It had been a few hours since their encounter in the hospital room. Dean's hand shook slightly as he answered the call, his voice steady as he greeted her. "Hey, Mia. What's up?" His tone was deliberately light, but he could feel the weight of the conversation approaching. "I need to talk to you," Mia's voice crackled through the line. "Something's off, Dean. I just got off the phone with the hospital. They said Jake hasn't been responding. They said they found him passed out in a storage closet. What's going on?" Dean's stomach lurched. She had found Jake. "Mia," Dean said, forcing his voice to remain steady, though he could hear the panic creeping in. "Jake's been working too hard lately. Maybe he overdid it. You know, one of those 16-hour shifts. He probably just crashed, you know?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched on like an eternity. Dean's heart was hammering in his chest. He could feel his every breath as if it echoed through the entire car. "Dean, that doesn't make sense," Mia said, her voice low. "I've been working with Jake for years. He's never acted like this. Something's wrong. I think you know more than you're letting on." Dean cursed under his breath. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had to think of something to keep Mia from digging deeper, but his mind was a tangled mess of fear and desperation. Mia, listen to me, Dean said quickly, his voice tinged with urgency. I don't know what you think you've found, but you're overreacting. This isn't anything we can't handle. I'm handling it. I've already called in for backup. They'll clear things up. I just need you to stay out of it for now. He could feel the hesitation on the other end of the line, but Mia wasn't convinced. Dean, I don't trust this, she said, her voice trembling with suspicion. Something's wrong. I can feel it. I think we need to tell someone about Jake. We need to figure out what happened before. No, Dean snapped, his voice growing more forceful than he intended. You can't. Not now. Just trust me. I'll handle it. Please. There was another long pause. Mia was silent. Dean's breath was shallow, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed her to believe him. He needed her to back off, or she would be next. He couldn't afford to lose her, too. Fine, Mia finally said, her tone reluctant. But if anything goes wrong, Dean, I'm coming for answers. You don't want me on your tail. The line went dead, and Dean sat there in the dark, staring at the phone in his hand. He exhaled deeply, trying to calm his racing heart. That had been too close. Mia had nearly cracked the case wide open, and if she kept pressing, she would. But Dean wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not when he was so close to finishing everything. He sat in his car for another few minutes, trying to think. He needed to take control. He needed to move faster. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. This time, it was an unknown number. Dean hesitated, but then answered. Hello? Dean, a voice said. A voice that he instantly recognized. It was Jake. His heart stopped. Jake was awake. Dean, what the hell happened? Jake's voice was weak, but it was unmistakable. I'm in some storage room. What did you do? What's going on? Dean's mind spun, his thoughts moving faster than he could process. He had no idea how Jake had managed to wake up, how he was even conscious, but there was no time to think about that now. Jake, Dean said, his voice tight. I don't know what you think happened, but you need to stay quiet. Understand me? You don't want to get anyone else involved. You're just tired, okay? That's all this was. Don't complicate things. Don't make it worse. I'm not going down like this, Dean, Jake said, his voice now filled with anger and fear. You don't get to cover this up anymore. I'm calling for help. I'm telling them everything. Dean's blood ran cold. Jake was awake, and he was threatening to expose him. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Dean clenched his fists, rage and fear boiling up inside him. This was it. This was the moment everything could fall apart. Jake, Dean said, his voice as low as a whisper. You've made a mistake, and now I'm going to fix it. He slammed the phone down, already planning his next move. Jake had made his choice, but now Dean had to make his, and there was no going back. The air outside the hospital was crisp, and Dean felt a cold shiver run through him as he stepped out of the building. The night sky was overcast, and the streetlights illuminated the parking lot in harsh, yellow halos. He didn't take a deep breath as he usually would. It felt as though the air around him had thickened, smothering him. He was carrying a weight that didn't show on the outside, but pressed heavily on his chest. The more time passed, the more he felt like everything was slipping further and further from his control. It had been hours since he had locked Jake in the storage closet. He'd done it without hesitation, dragging the officer's limp form, making sure no one saw, and leaving him behind. His mind raced, but his body remained eerily calm. He had to be careful. Every step had to be perfect. Dean reached his patrol car, his hand resting on the door for a moment. His eyes darted around the parking lot. No one was around. No one knew what had happened in that room, but he couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. He slid into the driver's seat, gripped the steering wheel, and started the engine. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car as he pulled out of the parking lot. He couldn't go home, not yet. He needed to think, to plan. The hospital had been a near miss, but now, Rachel was still a threat. He had told himself he wouldn't hurt her, not if he could avoid it. He had convinced himself she'd be fine, that her memory would fade with the coma. But now, every passing second felt like an eternity. What if she woke up? What if she remembered him, what he'd done? It was only a matter of time before she could become his undoing. He couldn't allow that. Dean drove through the quiet streets of the city, passing empty stores and dark houses. The clock on his dashboard flicked over to 2:30 a.m. A small corner of his mind began to piece together a new plan, one that could solve everything once and for all. He parked the car in a secluded area by a small diner that closed late at night. There was no one around. The streetlights cast long shadows, and Dean could barely see the outline of the diner's sign. He needed privacy, space to think without interruption. It wasn't just Rachel anymore. It was everyone. Jake, Mia, the entire force. It was all threatening to come apart. They would come looking for Jake. They would notice his absence. And soon enough, someone would start looking into Rachel's case, into the strange circumstances surrounding the accident. The lies, the inconsistencies. It would all come crashing down. Dean wasn't the type to panic, but that didn't mean the fear wasn't creeping up behind him. He had to think quickly. He couldn't afford to wait for someone to catch onto the threads he was carefully unraveling. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his stomach turning as he saw the name on the screen. Mia Sullivan. It had been a few hours since their encounter in the hospital room. Dean's hand shook slightly as he answered the call, his voice steady as he greeted her. "Hey, Mia. What's up?" His tone was deliberately light, but he could feel the weight of the conversation approaching. "I need to talk to you," Mia's voice crackled through the line. "Something's off, Dean. I just got off the phone with the hospital. They said Jake hasn't been responding. They said they found him passed out in a storage closet. What's going on?" Dean's stomach lurched. She had found Jake. "Mia," Dean said, forcing his voice to remain steady, though he could hear the panic creeping in. "Jake's been working too hard lately. Maybe he overdid it. You know, one of those 16-hour shifts. He probably just crashed, you know?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched on like an eternity. Dean's heart was hammering in his chest. He could feel his every breath as if it echoed through the entire car. "Dean, that doesn't make sense," Mia said, her voice low. "I've been working with Jake for years. He's never acted like this. Something's wrong. I think you know more than you're letting on." Dean cursed under his breath. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had to think of something to keep Mia from digging deeper, but his mind was a tangled mess of fear and desperation. "Mia, listen to me," Dean said quickly, his voice tinged with urgency. "I don't know what you think you've found, but you're overreacting. This isn't anything we can't handle. I'm handling it. I've already called in for backup. They'll clear things up. I just need you to stay out of it for now." He could feel the hesitation on the other end of the line, but Mia wasn't convinced. "Dean, I don't trust this," she said, her voice trembling with suspicion. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. I think we need to tell someone about Jake. We need to figure out what happened before." "No," Dean snapped, his voice growing more forceful than he intended. "You can't. Not now. Just trust me. I'll handle it. Please." There was another long pause. Mia was silent. Dean's breath was shallow, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed her to believe him. He needed her to back off, or she would be next. He couldn't afford to lose her, too. "Fine," Mia finally said, her tone reluctant. "But if anything goes wrong, Dean, I'm coming for answers. You don't want me on your tail." The line went dead, and Dean sat there in the dark, staring at the phone in his hand. He exhaled deeply, trying to calm his racing heart. That had been too close. Mia had nearly cracked the case wide open, and if she kept pressing, she would. But Dean wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not when he was so close to finishing everything. He sat in his car for another few minutes, trying to think. He needed to take control. He needed to move faster. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. This time, it was an unknown number. Dean hesitated, but then answered. "Hello?" "Dean," a voice said. A voice that he instantly recognized. It was Jake. His heart stopped. Jake was awake. "Dean, What the hell happened? Jake's voice was weak, but it was unmistakable. I'm in some storage room. What did you do? What's going on? Dean's mind spun, his thoughts moving faster than he could process. He had no idea how Jake had managed to wake up, how he was even conscious, but there was no time to think about that now. Jake, Dean said, his voice tight. I don't know what you think happened, but you need to stay quiet. Understand me? You don't want to get anyone else involved. You're just tired, okay? That's all this was. Don't complicate things. Don't make it worse. I'm not going down like this, Dean, Jake said, his voice now filled with anger and fear. You don't get to cover this up anymore. I'm calling for help. I'm telling them everything. Dean's blood ran cold. Jake was awake, and he was threatening to expose him. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Dean clenched his fists, rage and fear boiling up inside him. This was it. This was the moment everything could fall apart. Jake, Dean said, his voice as low as a whisper. You've made a mistake, and now I'm going to fix it. He slammed the phone down, already planning his next move. Jake had made his choice, but now Dean had to make his. And there was no going back. Dean's mind was racing as he sped down the darkened highway, the glow from the dashboard casting eerie shadows across his face. He had to act fast. Jake was awake. He was threatening to expose everything Dean had worked so hard to bury. Dean gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckling white as his thoughts spiraled out of control. Jake had always been loyal, always trusted him, but now Jake was a threat, a huge one. And Dean couldn't afford threats right now. The phone call had left him seething. He could hear Jake's words echoing in his mind, each one like a hammer striking a nail deeper into his own coffin. I'm telling them everything. Dean shook his head, trying to clear the rage that clouded his judgment. He couldn't let Jake get away with this. He couldn't risk everything unraveling now. His entire life was on the line. His career, his future, the quiet life he had been building. The truth was too dangerous. As the car hurtled through the night, a plan began to form. There was a place, a secluded cabin just outside the city. It was a spot Dean had used before, a place where things could be dealt with. If Jake was going to go rogue, if he wasn't going to stay quiet, Dean had no choice but to make sure he never got the chance to talk. Dean pressed down harder on the accelerator, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He had to get to Jake before Jake could get to anyone else. He couldn't risk Mia getting involved, or worse, Rachel waking up and remembering things she shouldn't. If Rachel remembered him at all, if she woke up and pieced things together, he knew she would never stay silent. She would be the last person to protect him. It wasn't just Jake. It was everything. The familiar road to the cabin stretched out before him, winding through tall trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. The house was isolated, far enough from town to ensure no one would hear a thing. It was perfect. Too perfect. Dean turned the headlights off as he made the final turn down a narrow gravel path leading to the cabin. The darkness enveloped him completely, but he felt no fear. Only the familiar coldness that had taken root in him long ago. He was used to hiding, used to covering his tracks. But this was different. This wasn't just about keeping secrets anymore. This was about survival. When Dean pulled into the gravel driveway, the cabin stood eerily silent in the night. He parked the car near the door, ensuring that no one would be able to see him approaching. He grabbed his bag from the back seat, the weight of the contents settling heavily in his hands. He had to be careful. Jake was dangerous now, more dangerous than he had ever been before. But Dean was prepared. He had planned for this. With a quick glance around to make sure no one had followed, Dean approached the cabin. He slid the key into the lock and turned it slowly, careful not to make a sound. The door creaked as it opened, and the familiar smell of wood and dust hit him immediately. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him and locking it. He didn't have much time. He needed to find Jake, make sure he was still unconscious, and then figure out how to deal with the situation once and for all. The cabin was empty at first glance. It was dark, with only a few shafts of moonlight sneaking through the narrow windows. Dean moved quickly through the space, checking each room in turn. The silence was deafening, but as he made his way to the back of the cabin, he heard something, a soft groan, followed by a rasping breath. Jake. Dean's heart raced. He moved toward the sound, his steps silent on the wooden floor. There, in the dim light, was Jake, slumped in a chair, his head drooping forward, eyes barely open. "You're awake," Dean said, his voice low, dangerous. Jake's eyes flickered up at him, filled with confusion and anger. What did you do to me? What happened?" Dean said nothing, only stepped closer to the chair. He had to get Jake to stay still, to stay quiet. "I'm not gonna let you ruin everything, Jake," Dean said, his voice calm but cold. "You should have stayed out of this. You should have kept your mouth shut." Jake's gaze sharpened, his jaw tightening as he realized the gravity of the situation. "You're insane, Dean. You think you can just—" Dean didn't let him finish. He pulled out a small vial from his bag, liquid that could put anyone out cold within minutes. He'd used it before, on those who got too close to the truth. As Jake started to struggle, Dean quickly injected the syringe into Jake's arm. It was over almost instantly. Jake's body went limp, his head falling to one side, his breath shallow and slow. Dean stood over him, watching as Jake's chest rose and fell in the slow rhythm of unconsciousness. His hand tightened around the syringe. He was done. He had no choice. There was no going back now. He reached into the bag again, pulling out a length of rope. He secured Jake's wrists tightly to the chair, making sure he wouldn't be able to move when he woke up. The ropes were tight, cutting into Jake's skin, but Dean didn't care. He didn't care about Jake anymore. He cared about himself. He had to make sure nothing came between him and his escape. Dean stood back, surveying the room. It was done. Jake wouldn't wake up for hours. He had time to think, time to breathe. But as Dean turned to leave the room, a soft sound stopped him in his tracks, a soft creak from the back door. Someone was outside. His heart skipped a beat. His mind raced. Could it be Mia? Or someone else? Had they followed him here? Dean's body went rigid. He couldn't risk anyone showing up now. He couldn't risk anyone getting in the way. He pulled his gun from the holster, his fingers trembling as he checked the chamber. Another creak. Then, a faint whisper of movement. Someone was out there. But who? Dean moved quickly, ducking behind a large wooden beam in the corner of the room. He held his breath, waiting for the next sound. Another step. Then the door swung open, and a figure stepped into the cabin. It was Mia. Dean's pulse spiked, his mind racing as he tried to think of his next move. What was she doing here? Had she followed him? Had she figured it out? Mia stood in the doorway, her eyes darting around the cabin, searching for something. When her gaze landed on Jake, unconscious and tied to the chair, her face went pale. "Mia," Dean said, his voice sharp but controlled. "You shouldn't have come here." Mia's eyes locked on Dean, and in that moment, he knew. She wasn't going to let this go. Not now. "I knew it," Mia said, her voice barely a whisper. "I knew something wasn't right. What have you done, Dean?" Dean's heart sank as Mia stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. There was no more running. There was no more lying. She was here, and she knew too much. But there was one thing Dean was certain of. Mia was going to be just as much a problem as Jake had been, and he couldn't let her walk out of here alive. "Mia," Dean said, his voice low, his finger curling around the trigger. "You need to leave. Now." Mia stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "You don't understand," she whispered, backing away slowly. "This isn't you, Dean. This is a mistake." Dean didn't answer. He couldn't afford to let her talk him out of it. She wasn't going to leave here alive. Not anymore. The silence was broken only by the sound of his breath as he prepared to make his final move. Mia's eyes locked onto Dean's, her gaze flickering from the gun in his hand to his face, searching for any hint of hesitation. For a split second, Dean almost wished he could just explain it all to her. Tell her that everything had spiraled out of control, that he never meant for things to get this far. But he couldn't. He couldn't let her see his weakness. Not now. Not when he was this close to everything finally being under his control. Mia took another cautious step back, her hands raised slightly in a placating gesture. She wasn't panicking, but Dean could see the calculation in her eyes. She was trying to figure out her next move, trying to find some way to disarm him, either physically or emotionally. but Dean had already been down that road too many times. I didn't want this, Dean, Mia said, her voice soft but firm, her steps still slow, measured. I didn't want to think this was happening, but you've gone too far. This is insane. Dean's grip tightened on the gun. He could feel the weight of it, the cold metal pressing against his palm. He knew what he had to do. There was no other way out of this. You don't understand, Mia, Dean said, his voice low, his jaw clenched. You think you do, but you don't. This is the only way. The only way to protect everything we've worked for. You don't get it. You never did. Mia's eyes narrowed as she took another small step backward, her body language growing more defensive. Dean, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but with an edge of desperation. You don't have to do this. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help. Just let me help. Dean interrupted, his voice rising, the frustration seeping through his words. There's no help, Mia. Don't you get it? You're too late. Everything's too far gone. I'm the only one left who can fix this. I'm the only one who can stop it. He wasn't sure if the words were meant for her or himself, but as soon as they left his mouth, something shifted in the room. The silence between them felt thicker now, heavier. Mia's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes, something that had been flickering in the back of her mind, just beneath the surface, was starting to surface now. She was scared, but it wasn't just fear for herself. It was scary for him, for what he had become. Mia, Dean said again, his voice softer this time. Please, just go. Leave. I won't hurt you. But if you don't leave now, you'll make things worse. You don't want to see where this goes. Mia's hands dropped to her sides, her fingers twitching as if she were about to do something. Reach for a weapon, maybe, or try to tackle him. Dean's grip tightened, his finger brushing against the trigger. He couldn't let her get any closer. Not now. I don't want to hurt you either, Mia, Dean said, his voice tinged with a sincerity that almost made him believe his own words. But you have to leave. Right now. Before it's too late. Mia's breath hitched as she looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion and disbelief. She wasn't backing down. Not yet. Dean. I know you, Mia said, her voice shaking. I know you. You're not this guy. You're not this. Dean's eyes flickered, but he didn't let the doubt show. He had to stay focused. If he let her get to him, if he allowed any part of him to believe the words she was saying, it would be over. The facade would crack, and everything would come crumbling down around him. He couldn't afford that. Not now. Not when he was so close to finishing everything. I am this guy, Dean said coldly, his voice hardening once more. This is who I am. And this is what needs to happen. Mia's face twisted in anguish as she tried once again to reason with him. Dean, no. This isn't you. You're not a killer. You're not someone who does this. But before she could finish, Dean acted. The gunshot rang out in the cabin, a deafening crack that echoed off the walls, silencing Mia's voice in an instant. Mia's body jerked back as the bullet struck her in the shoulder, sending her sprawling to the floor with a scream. Dean's hand didn't shake. His face didn't betray the storm of emotions brewing inside him. He had done it. He had made the decision. He had crossed the line. Mia gasped for breath, her face contorted in pain as she tried to clutch her bleeding shoulder. Her eyes locked onto Dean's, a mixture of shock, betrayal, and desperation in them. Why? She whispered, her voice faint as she struggled to stay conscious. Why, Dean? Dean stood over her, the gun still aimed at her. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face was cold, emotionless. He couldn't afford to feel anything. He couldn't afford to let the weight of her gaze crack him open. Because I have no choice, he said flatly, his voice unwavering. Mia's breath was shallow now, each one coming harder than the last. Her eyes darted to the door, as if she thought she could still escape, still reach out for help. But there was no one coming. There was no one left to help her. Dean took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers, his voice barely a whisper now. You should have listened to me, Mia. You should have left when you had the chance. Mia's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She just stared up at him, her face pale and tear-streaked, as if she had already resigned herself to her fate. Dean felt a brief moment of something, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "I'm sorry," Dean muttered, though he didn't mean it. The words were for his own sake. He didn't want to feel anything. He couldn't. He raised the gun again, his finger hovering over the trigger. But before he could pull it, something caught his eye, a slight movement at the edge of the door. A shadow. Dean froze. His heart skipped a beat. Someone was here. His thoughts raced as the door creaked open slowly, just enough for a figure to slip inside. It wasn't Mia. It wasn't anyone he had expected. It was Jake. Jake, still groggy but standing, his arms unbound. His eyes were wild with panic as he staggered toward them, still groggy from the sedative. "Dean," Jake called weakly, his voice strained. "What have you done? What the hell have you done?" Dean's pulse quickened. He had underestimated Jake. He had thought Jake would be out for hours. But here he was, awake and furious, struggling to make sense of the chaos around him. Dean's mind raced again, and for the first time, a sense of real panic set in. He had to finish this. He had to. But now there was no turning back. "Jake," Dean started, his voice shaking for the first time. He took a step backward, gun still aimed at Mia. Jake's eyes narrowed as he reached for something on the ground. Anything to help him. He was more than just awake. He was angry. "I'm going to make you pay for this, Dean," Jake said with a snarl, a dangerous edge to his voice. Dean's heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't from fear. It was from adrenaline. Things were slipping. Fast. And there was only one way out. Conclusion, Dean stood frozen, the gun still trembling in his hand as he locked eyes with Rachel. His mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything he had done, everything he had tried to control, had led to this moment. And now, Rachel was standing before him, fully aware of the truth. Her eyes, wide with disbelief and fear, locked onto the gun. She was barely standing, her face pale from the remnants of her injuries, but her determination shone through. She knew what Dean had done. She knew the lengths he had gone to in order to protect his dark secrets. "Dean," Rachel whispered, her voice fragile but steady. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to keep running from the truth. It's not too late to make things right." Dean's hand shook, the weight of the gun heavy in his palm. He could feel the walls closing in on him. He had spent so long trying to bury the truth, trying to convince himself that he could outrun the consequences of his actions. But now, it was all crashing down. For the first time, Dean truly felt the weight of his choices. Mia, Jake, Rachel. He had hurt them all in the name of protecting his own lies. He had convinced himself that there was no other way, that he had to keep control. But looking at Rachel now, he realized that the price of that control had been too high. "I'm sorry," Dean whispered, though the words felt hollow. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Rachel's eyes softened slightly, but the sadness was still there, lingering. "It doesn't have to end this way, Dean. You don't have to be this person." Dean's chest tightened. Could he really change? Could he really stop running from the truth and make things right? Or had he already gone too far? The gun in his hand felt lighter now, but he didn't lower it. He didn't know if he was ready to let go of the control he had so carefully built. The power, the lies, the darkness. But as Rachel took a step closer, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and compassion. Something inside him shifted. He had spent so long trying to protect himself, but now he realized that the only way to stop the cycle was to face what he had done. Dean slowly lowered the gun, his hand trembling as he let it fall to his side. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the weight of what had just happened, and what could still happen. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he didn't want to run from it anymore. Rachel nodded slowly, as if she understood the battle he had just fought within himself. She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Dean took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with a sense of finality. It wasn't too late to change. He wasn't sure how he would make amends, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep living in the shadows of his past. As the night stretched on, and the darkness of the cabin seemed to melt away, Dean finally understood what he needed to do. It wasn't about running or hiding anymore. It was about facing the consequences and accepting the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, it felt like the start of something new. Something that might not be easy, but something that had to be done. The journey ahead would be long, and there were still many hurdles to face. But for the first time in years, Dean felt a small glimmer of hope. He had made it through the worst of it, and now it was time to rebuild. Whatever that meant. The story wasn't over, but this was the beginning of his reckoning.